have worried about, maybe have struggled with. But that was a question that came up. So I thought I would take that. What I've done actually is I've adapted a talk that I sometimes give in schools for this morning, and I've just adapted it for this morning. So, where is God when it hurts? As I say, this may be a question that you've thought about. If you've been a Christian for many years, you may have thought quite deeply about this question. If you're just starting out on the Christian adventure, or if you are thinking about Christianity but you haven't really started a relationship with Jesus yet, then this may be a question which bothers you. It bothers quite a lot of people. Or it may be that actually you've had a relationship with Jesus for so long now that it's his presence in your life that sustains you each and every day. And your answer to this question is really easy. And the answer is here. He's here with me, and I know him. And that's the answer to the question. But there's a lot to this question to talk about. It may also be there are some of us who have been Christians for so long that we've forgotten about this question. Because sometimes what happens to us as Christians is, if you don't talk to all that many non-Christians, sometimes about faith matters, you forget what kind of questions non-Christians ask. And I often find this in groups, that sometimes we as Christians can kind of lose touch with what non-Christians are thinking about and talking about and the questions they're asking. And so this always comes top of the list of questions that people generally ask when you think about God and the common objections to the existence of God. This is always right up there at the top of the list. How can there be a God with so much suffering? I do find it interesting, actually, to talk about this in schools and also with groups. And so I just hope it's a blessing to you putting it this way this morning. I start with a Facebook post from back in 2020 from a lady called Kate. That's not her real name. She used to be a member of this church and then she moved to a different country. Kate put on her Facebook post in 2020, "If you ever doubt God shines a light in the world, this morning he used a giant torch." I think she'd been out early, been for a morning walk, and had enjoyed a beautiful sunrise. And then someone on her Facebook said, "Wow, that's gorgeous." But then another friend put, "Sure, but if he can do this sort of thing, why did he send us a virus?" This was early on in COVID-19, just after coronavirus had disrupted all of our lives. This post came. And so I thought that encapsulated it quite nicely, really. The beauty of creation that we've been singing about this morning, but then why did COVID-19 happen? So just to reflect a little bit on coronavirus, if you've forgotten, how could we forget? But if you have, 227,000 people died in the UK. Over 3 million people died across the world. It was young people as well as old. You may know some people who died of COVID. Thousands died alone. And isolation in COVID, as we now know very much, damaged people's mental health in ways that we're still finding out. I imagine most people here were vaccinated, but just 10% of Africa was fully vaccinated, which just illustrates, doesn't it, the injustice and the inequalities across the world. So, coronavirus. If you go much further back in history, there's quite a famous example. This example is famous because of what it did to people's thinking in Europe at the time. So, in Lisbon, on the 1st of November 1755, there was a huge earthquake. The reason that date is significant is that the 1st of November is All Saints' Day in the church calendar. And because of that, Lisbon churches were absolutely full of people. Everyone was in church that day. It so happened that was the day a massive earthquake struck and those churches collapsed. And the death toll for that time was huge. 30,000 people and more died that day. Many were in church, The city of Lisbon and its surroundings were flattened. Now, the reason, as I say, it was interesting, as well as disastrous and a tragedy, was that the prevailing philosophy of Europe in that time was that of somebody called Gottfried Leibniz, who said, this, the world we live in, is the best of all possible worlds. That was his philosophy. This is the best of all possible worlds. It's known in philosophy as optimism, with a capital O. And as you can imagine, after that earthquake, this philosophy went into decline because it was impossible to hold on to the idea that this world we see is the best of all possible worlds. How could you possibly hold on to that philosophy when you just had this massive, destructive earthquake? So we are aware, aren't we, of this? And so the way philosophers often put it is like this, is that there are three things that people claim. Well, there are two things that believers in God often claim, which are that God is love and that God is all-powerful. But in the reality of evil in the world, how can both those things be true? And so this is sometimes called the inconsistent triad. If you've been in school recently, you may have heard of that. How can all those three things be true? Well, what we're going to do this morning is we're just going to take a very quick tour through what the Bible says about suffering before getting to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, which Shona read to us. So first of all, God created the world perfect. God saw all that he had made in Genesis, and it was very good. But second of all, when human beings let sin into the world, suffering came too. So God says to Adam, because you have sinned, cursed is the ground because of you. Thirdly, the Bible is clear that bad things happen to good people. The story of Job is there in the Bible to illustrate that good people suffer alongside bad people, and it's not necessarily their fault. And finally, we don't know why God allows suffering any more than anybody else does. We don't know why God allows suffering. Psalm 22 echoes that pain in the way that it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? The writer of that poem, that song, was just lamenting, was just bemoaning. And as we know, Jesus took up those words on the cross. So that's the Bible and suffering, part one. And many people cannot cope with that. Here's one famous person. This is a little bit shocking, this video. I hope the video works. But this video is slightly shocking to Christian ears sometimes. Are we all right with the sound there, do you think? Should we give it a go? Let's see what this guy says.
Suppose what Oscar believed in as he died, in spite of your protestations, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on that?
No, but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, and if it was the 12 Greek gods, then I would have more truck with it, because the Greeks they didn't pretend not to be human in their appetites and in their capriciousness and in their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all-seeing, all-wise, all-kind, all-beneficent. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac, totally selfish. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable. So, atheism is not just about don't parent. He is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, your life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living, in my opinion.
That sure is the longest answer to that question that I ever got in this entire series.
As you listen to that, it's quite shocking, isn't it, to Christian ears? But we need to hear the strength of this kind of an argument if we're going to be able to reply to it. One person that has done this really well, I think, is the next video here, which is Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley is someone who works a lot in this kind of area, and I love the way he answers Stephen Fry. Here he is.
Dear Stephen, I, along with many others, have watched the video in which you explained what you would say to God if you met him. And you explained how, because of a world in which we live of suffering and injustice, you'd have to tell that God that he's a mean, stupid maniac of a God. Now, I'm a Christian, and my first reaction to that was to want to tell you, look, I'll give you 5 bulletproof reasons for why that's not the way God is. But then I kind of realised, actually, you're not really giving an argument against God, more an expression of your anger that the world is the way it is if a God is in charge of it. And so rather than give you some kind of a philosophical rebuttal, I thought I'd tell you a story. Now, we probably don't have that much in common, but one thing we probably do share is a mutual love of the literary genius of this man, Oscar Wilde. That's why we're filming here today on a cold winter's day at his memorial in central London. Now, I know that you share a deep connection with Oscar Wilde, but I have something in common with him too, and that is that he believed in the same God that I believe in. I've just been reading recently to my kids Oscar Wilde's stories for children. They're absolutely brilliant, and actually I think they're for adults as well. My favourite definitely is the story of the selfish giant. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I think Oscar Wilde in this story expresses actually the true nature of God. The story centres on a garden. It's a garden where it's always winter and never spring. Children used to play there, but they don't play there anymore. And it's all because of the giant's selfishness that has brought this down on this beautiful garden. Interestingly, the Christian story also begins with a garden. And however you interpret that story, fundamentally, it's about the idea that from the beginning, the world has gone wrong because of us. And in many ways, that's bent the whole world out of shape. So in a sense, we're living in the winter garden that Oscar Wilde describes. But in the story, after many years of it being winter and never spring in his garden, the giant sees a child, Silver Fruit. Well, Wilde takes up the story. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child, and when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, that I may take my big sword and slay him."